This isn't just a podcast, it's a movement. The Middle Ground Mike is fighting for truth and unity. Subscribe now or support us today. Links are in the notes. Stand with us. Americans were sold a lie, but not by one party, but by an entire system that seems to have benefited from us not paying attention because we put too much trust. We were told that foreign threats come with tanks, troops, and headlines. We were told that if China or Russia ever challenged U.S. influence, we'd see it clearly and respond decisively. Instead, they showed up at loans, surveillance equipment, intelligence advisors, and cartel money. And by the time the average American noticed Venezuela collapsing, the leverage was already locked in. This episode, we're talking about some other stuff. It's about something that should make everyone uncomfortable, regardless of your ideology. This isn't socialism versus capitalism. This isn't Democrat versus Republican. This isn't conservative versus liberal. This is about how two authoritarian powers quietly embedded themselves in the Western Hemisphere, while the United States argued about cable news narratives. And at the center of this story is Hugo El Pollo Carvajal, not a pundit, not a Twitter voice, but Venezuela's former military intelligence chief. His story matters because it exposes how power actually moves when no one is watching. If you think this episode is exaggerating, good. That means you're paying attention, because once you hear some of the facts and the timelines and the money flows, the real question becomes this: how did we let this happen in our own hemisphere? And is there more to it? This guy wasn't a whistleblower, but he was an architect. Hugo wasn't some rogue officer who stumbled into corruption and, he was appointed the head of Venezuela's military counterintelligence directorate, DGCIM, in 2004 by Hugo Chavez himself. That position put him in charge of monitoring military loyalty, suppressing internal dissent, and coordinating with foreign intelligence services. Intelligence chiefs don't just collect information, they shape reality inside authoritarian systems. Carvajal was trusted because he understood where power actually lived. Under Chavez, Venezuela deliberately fused military, intelligence services, and ruling party into one structure. Cuban intelligence officers were from the G2, were embedded inside Venezuela's security apparatus, advising on counterintelligence and population control. Russian intelligence services, including the GRU, provided doctrine, training, and operational coordination because we isolated them. China focused on technology, databases, financing, but always through state-controlled channels / CCP-owned companies. Carvajal sat at the intersection of all three of these. When the United States indicted him for narcotics trafficking and later extradited him, it wasn't about one man moving drugs. It was about someone who knew how drug money, intelligence cooperation, and foreign influence work together. This is why cooperation matters, and why we need to have a better foothold in even some of the countries we don't agree with economically. But he wasn't a witness to the chaos. He was part of the system that made the chaos useful. Venezuela did not fail. It was melt. It didn't collapse overnight, and it didn't collapse accidentally. The country was with the largest proven oil reserves on the planet didn't just mismanage itself into irrelevance. What happened instead was the creation of a parallel economy designed to survive sanctions and accountability. Oil revenues declined, but illicit revenues exploded. This wasn't incompetence. This was adaptation. U.S. prosecutors, the DEA, Colombian intelligence agencies have documented how elements of the Venezuelan military facilitated cocaine shipments originating with the FARC in Colombia. Flights left Venezuelan airfields under military control and moved drugs through Caribbean routes. So came through the Caribbean up through, the Gulf of, now we call it the Gulf of America, but / Gulf of Mexico, areas like that. It became, I believe, known as the Cartel de los Soles. I could be saying it wrong. And its existence has been corroborated by multiple indictments and intelligence assessments. The drug money is untraceable, unsanctionable, and it's perfect for authoritarian survival because now you got some money coming in to do the things that you want to do militarily, even if your people are suffering because, all the sanctions have been put on you. So kind of makes sense. The shadow economy that has developed in Venezuela is something the sanctions couldn't touch, especially when you look at things like Bitcoin, right? Liquidity. It paid for loyalty, foreign advisors, weapons, and repression. It also made Venezuela attractive to foreign powers who wanted to influence without scrutiny, i.e., China, Russia. So when people say Venezuela failed, they miss the point. It didn't fail, it was stripped for parts. Russia, chaos is not a side effect, it was the goal. Russia did not invest in Venezuela because it believed in socialism or Chavez. Russia invested because Venezuela offered strategic chaos at low cost. Moscow supplied weapon systems, including air defense equipment. Didn't do that well of a job, at low cost. And, they conducted joint military exercises with the Chinese, and the Chinese need oil. Russian strategic bombers landed in Venezuela, I believe, in '08. And I mean, even in the Chavez years, they were helping, I believe, as well. Not because they were needed militarily, but because symbolism matters. It was an attempt to signal to Washington, D.C. that we can show up here too. The Russian state energy company became deeply embedded in Venezuela oil sector. Remember, our oil companies got kicked out when Hugo Chavez took over, even taking key stakes in their assets. These deals helped Venezuela skirt sanctions while giving Russia larger leverage over energy flows. More importantly, they created beginning bargaining chips for Russia in its broader confrontations with the West, particularly the United States. Venezuela became a pressure point that could be activated whenever needed. That's partnership. That's not partnership, that's positioning. Instability has served Russia perfectly. But here's another one. China debt is the weapon. Data is the prize. So China's involvement here, and especially in Venezuela, was far more calculated and far more patient. Starting in the mid-2000s, Chinese state banks issued more than $60 billion in loans to Venezuela through the China Development Bank. These loans were often repaid in oil, locking Venezuela into long-term commodity dependence. So again, this is about oil. The contracts were opaque, shielded from public oversight, and tied to Chinese contractors and equipment that are tied to the CCP. This wasn't aid, it was strategic financing. So when Venezuela couldn't repay, China didn't walk away. They didn't say, oh, okay, no problem. No, it renegotiated, extended timelines, and deepened dependency. Debt for China is not a problem. It's leverage that matures over time. The United States used to use that. Countries become potentially cautious, technologically dependent, and diplomatically aligned because they have no choice. Venezuela, prime example. China also exported surveillance technology there. Companies like ZTE helped build Venezuela's fatherland card. It's a system, and it's a digital ID tied to food access, healthcare, and voting behavior. It allowed the government there to reward loyalty and punish dissent at scale and make it look a whole lot nicer. China didn't need Venezuela to love it. It needed Venezuela to rely on it. The authoritarianism 2.0 there was tested here first. When Venezuela built was not old school dictatorship, it was digital authoritarianism. Cuban intelligence advisors had provided for decades of experience. Population monitoring, oppression, Chinese firms obviously provided the hardware, the databases, software, you name it. You got the Russian tactics, facial recognition in there. You got your biometric IDs, and you got centralized databases, like they're trying to build everywhere here in the United States, and people are pushing back. But, it allowed the regime there to know who the citizens were, where they lived, and how they voted. It gave them access to subsidized food. So remember, the more you depend on the government, the more they can tell you what to do. And services that could be turned off at whim if they didn't like you. Protesters could be identified and neutralized early. Fear became administrative, not violent. That's more efficient and harder to sanction. That model didn't stay in Venezuela. It's now Nicaragua, Cuba, other parts of Central America, same tools, same logic, just different flags. Migration is a feature, not a bug though. Millions of Venezuelans didn't flee by accident. When people lose economic access, their voice in the political arena, they fear for their personal safety, leaving becomes their only option in their heads. These regimes understand this and often will allow it. Migration exports pressure outward, right? Democracies absorb the cost. They know they're pushing it onto us. Venezuela's collapse destabilized Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, and eventually the U.S. southern border. This influx strained social services and inflamed a crazy amount of domestic politics in the United States. It's insane. The immigration debates are now rage levels, and they now dominate our elections across the hemisphere, not just the United States, Europe too. That chaos benefits authoritarian powers who thrive on division. No invasion was needed. Migration became the leverage. And leverage doesn't show up on radar screens. You know what I mean? Like, come on. But Hugo Chavez, he's not dangerous because he's a hero. This is why he scares people in multiple countries. He's dangerous because he understands how the machine worked. So he understands the intricacies, right? He connected the narco-finance to the intelligence cooperation with with foreign intelligence, and then he also tied it into digital surveillance. It shows, and he showed, that Venezuela wasn't isolated. It was integrated into a global strategy. You know, his testimony threatens elites in Venezuela, embarrasses people here in the West. Our institutions that somehow miss some of this stuff, you know, the warning signs. When he's trying to expose how ideology blinded policymakers to financial and technological warfare. Whether every detail survives court scrutiny is secondary. The architecture matches reality on the ground. That's why his name keeps resurfacing. He's not just telling stories, he's pointing at the blueprint. Look at what they've done in Ukraine. Look at what China's trying to do with Taiwan. Look at what Indonesia is doing. These are all the same blueprints. Very similar. Look at some countries in Africa that are struggling, right? Look at how Russia handles itself. This is not new. This isn't random. This whole thing was about pushing out Russian and Chinese influence from South America. I mean, I don't necessarily agree with the way, but I mean, at the same time, it's not unprecedented. Or, you know, do you just sit there, tuck your tail between your legs and just hope it gets better? I don't know. I don't know what the final solution is on that, you know, but this is what failure actually looks like when you make simple mistakes sometimes. It didn't happen because Americans are weak. We're strong. It happened because our system assumed power still looks like it did in the 20th century. China and Russia have understood, and they've made a point, and they've even come out and told us they understand this, okay? They don't even hide it. They understand that the influence now moves through debt, data, and infrastructure and migration. And here in the US, we kept arguing about the norms. You know, we're still fighting about the same things. Elections are still being decided by the same alliances, and nothing's getting done. And it's hurting us, and it's hurting us on the world stage, especially the world stage. And our leaders are asleep at the wheel, it feels like. Maybe not on purpose. You know, this is not a left-wing or right-wing failure. Republican and Democrat administrations alike underestimated financialized influence. You know, short election cycles lost to long-term planning. This is why I say we can't get wind up over every little thing that CNN or whoever or whatever politician wants to throw out there if we don't know what's really going on. Don't be baited by them. That's how they get you distracted from this stuff, and that's how these things get missed. You know, the cost of ignoring this stuff in the hemisphere is now visible in our politics. I mean, just look at the things we're arguing about. Our borders. I mean, hello, it's chaos out there right now with, you know, and people are scared, you know, but some of the criminals got to go, right? But some of it could be handled a lot differently. You know, and our global standing among allies is hurt. And now when we're going to work with a neutral country or a country that has a new government in place, are they going to be less likely to do business with us? Especially if they have close proximity to one of those other nations. You know, the Western Hemisphere isn't lost, but it's no longer uncontested. And pretending otherwise only guarantees higher costs later and more BS. You know, if this episode made you angry, or at least got you thinking, that's the point. It means you recognize something was taken without your consent, and that's why the middle ground exists. To put out their systems that operate quietly while we're distracted by the noise. We don't answer to parties, governments, and that independence matters now more than ever. And if you want more episodes like this and help keep the lights on, you can support the show for as little as $1 at buymeacoffee.com/TMGM. That support funds research, production, and episodes that most platforms would rather you not hear. No left, no right, just forward. This is Joe. Have a good night.